When it comes to the debate about Confederate monuments, there seems to be a case to be made about the necessity to preserve them as a testimony to what happened in the U.S. history before and right after the Civil War. Apparently, the troubled heritage of the Southern states is something that needs to be acknowledged and reflected on to be aware of the mistakes of the past and be able to move on. However, if we look at the period corresponding to these monuments being put in place and try to identify who is making the case for them to remain in place, inconsistencies rapidly pile up and draw a totally different picture as to why some want to protect these cultural elements in the United States. The vast majority of the Confederate monuments paying tribute to the losing side of the war were erected between 1890 and 1950, with a spike between 1900 and 1920. While the early monuments were memorials mourning the dead soldiers, the latest tended to glorify leaders of the Confederacy like General Robert E. Lee, former President of the Confederacy Jefferson Davis, and General Thomas Stonewall Jackson. This goes to show that the monuments were not put in place as a reminder of the mistakes of the past, but as a way to glorify Confederate values long after this cause was defeated. Used as a representation of white supremacy during the Jim Crow era, Confederate monuments did not teach a lesson in history, but rather taught a lesson in domination directed towards an oppressed minority perceived as needing to be put back to its place and aiming at reinforcing a feeling of pride related to Southern heritage. Protecting the Confederate monuments is not an attempt to highlight the dark side of U.S. history. On the contrary, it's a blatant refusal to recognize the injustice of the principles they stood for, as the state rights the Confederacy fought to preserve were, plainly and simply, the right to continue to own slaves. The correct way to preserve remains of a condemnable ideology for educational purposes is in the context of a museum or as a guided experience to understand what is represented to the audience. As a consequence, one might argue that those who vandalize these monuments with inscriptions such as slave owner or Black Lives Matter serve such a purpose by providing the explanation lacking on the bare monument.